Alright gang, this is encounter 1. It's set up exactly like one of the menagerie encounters. This room's going to look entirely too familiar. If you watched your Cactus video, your Houndish video, your Dado video, whoever the fuck's video you watched, you're going to know exactly what this joint looks like. Alright, so starting this encounter out, you're going to rally at the bottom, right by the stairs. There's going to be a couple of denotations for areas that I mentioned, like left being left from the flag, mid being straight up from the flag, and right being straight up from the flag. What you'll see is I've noted here a couple of dots. These black dots, those are the feet of a statue. They're great for cover, and you can use them to hide behind. So right is kind of under those feet, mid's going to be on top of this little thing here, and left is going to be under these feet. Here's where we throw you a little curveball. Down here by the rally flag, it's this little green circle. It's going to give you the Witch's Blessing buff for about a minute, give or take. You don't want everybody to have this buff, but nobody cannot have this buff. So what we're going to do is we're going to split you into 3 teams of 2. 1 for left, 1 for mid, 1 for right. Each team's going to have a buffed and a non-buffed player. Here's where we throw you a little curveball. Down here by the rally flag, it's this little green circle. It's going to give you the Witch's Blessing buff for about a minute, give or take. You don't want everybody to have this buff, but nobody cannot have this buff. So what we're going to do is we're going to split you into 3 teams of 2. 1 for left, 1 for mid, 1 for right. Each team's going to have a buffed and a non-buffed player. Just to clarify, you got left has a blue, which is an unbuffed, and a green, a buffed. Mid has the same, right has the same. So you have 3 teams of 2, buffed, unbuffed players. Those are their positions. Now how do we progress this encounter? First of all, you got to get your buff. So the way this goes down is your 3 players who are going to stay behind and get your buff, while your 3 unbuffed players go assume their positions, are going to all hop into the circle at the same time. It takes 1 to 3 seconds. It's not very long to assume the buff. And once they all assume the buff, some things start to happen. So down here by the rally flag are going to be 2 knights. When you walk in, you can't damage them. They're just there. Now, they're going to be damaged only by the buffed players, who would then kill those 2 knights and then follow their arrow up to their designated area with their team as they've assumed their buff. And this is where things start to spawn. Now once we've killed our knights and assumed our buff, we're going to be joining our partners here, here, and here, left, right, and mid. So you got your 3 teams of 2. All 4 of these red locations that I've marked, those are your spawn locations for adds. You can have 2 different types. One, which is going to be your base wave of thralls, acolytes, etc. We're only going to be damaged by the unbuffed players. And then you're going to have knights, which are only damageable by the buffed players. To make matters slightly more complicated, at the farthest left and farthest right spawn on a layer above the ground level, there is going to be 2 sets of acolytes, 1 set buffed, 1 set unbuffed. These are boomers. These are shooting heavy exploding rounds at you, so you need to call out, we got buffed to the left or unbuffed to the right. How do you know if they're damageable by buffed or unbuffed? Well, if you're unbuffed and you can damage the enemies, clearly they're unbuffed. If you are unbuffed and they have a white aura around them and you can't damage them, that means they're only damageable by the buffed players, and vice versa. So all through this encounter there's going to be adds that only the buffed players can kill, which don't have a white outline, and then for the other players who either are buffed or unbuffed, respectively, they're going to see either a white outline or no outline, and they're going to have to damage their enemies. Now after we do this a while, we're going to start to run down our buff. And then another mechanic comes into play. So as our Witch's Blessing starts to come to a close, within about 10 seconds or so, everyone should be saying, hey, my blessing is up. Well, what do? We have 2 strats for this, and the streamers seem to all follow the same strat. So I'm going to show everyone that one, and then I'm going to show you the better way that most of the community has figured out. But for now, you'll notice I've erased some of the lines. Everything is kind of flowing at this point. We're killing our ads. What are we doing? Well, there's going to be some crystals spawn. And these crystals have to be damaged at range. They have no protective aura. You can just shoot them by a protected or a buffed and an unbuffed player at the same time. This should usually happen before your buff runs out, but not always, so just pay attention. Now one of these buffs is going to spawn over here to the left, and it's going to be anywhere in this back area, just like in the menagerie. There's going to be one in mid, and it's going to spawn anywhere in this area, kind of like the menagerie, and right. Now it'll be sometimes up at the front, up here by where the enemy spawns. Sometimes it'll be over here in the middle. Sometimes it'll be way over here in the back. And it's the same for the back corner over here. It can be anywhere. It can be in the air. It can be on the ground. You just got to look for it. Help each other out. Call out where it is with your buffed and your unbuffed players. Now, as your buff starts to run out, some people would scramble to go ahead and rearrange the buffs. That's fine. So when it's time to switch your buff, just like you see in the streams, all the players from the left, mid, and right team, so all 6 players are going to head to this crystal in the middle with this aura around it. And when everyone's inside, if an unbuffed and a buffed player both shoot it, then the buff's going to switch. So buffed players become unbuffed players, and unbuffed players become buffed players. That's the pretty base strat. After it happens, everyone just kind of assumes their original positions. There's going to be some ogre spawn. You got to do a total of 4 rounds with crystals and killing ads and swapping buffs. So just to run you through it from the beginning, you get your buff, you assume your positions with your left, mid, and right teammate, you kill some ads, you kill some crystals, you swap your buffs, you kill some ogres, and ogre's going to spawn either near the left or the rightmost spawn point. One will be buffed, one will be unbuffed, so you can just swap back and forth and say, hey, we got buffed ogre on left, and then everyone comes to that side and damages it with the buff, or unbuffed on right, you come to the side without the buff and you damage it. Wells are super useful, but they're not a necessity at this point. It's cool to have them, but if your warlocks run healing rifts, your titans run rally barricades, and you run damage output weaponry and supers, you can really excel in this encounter without having like high survivability. You just have to be smart with your buffs. And the buff rearranging is going to be a primary mechanic for the entire raid. So doing it that way, which is that everyone comes to the buff area here, stands in the circle, switches buffs, and then goes back to their original position. So now our blue, our unbuffed, and our green, our buffed, are gonna swap back and forth. So throughout the encounter, you may be buffed, you may be unbuffed, so you may either be killing knights or you may be killing acolytes and thrall. That's one way to do it, and it's totally fine if everyone's on the same page. Oh, at one point I'm going to be killing non-highlighted enemies, and then the highlight's going to switch when I take a different buff for the unbuff status, and then I'm only going to be killing the new enemies that don't have the white aura or the highlight on them. So you just got to be aware. Watching the videos is cool, but understanding how these mechanics and encounters really flow together, it can really change your perspective. So another way to do this is as follows. Alright, so let's say at this point we've designated our 3 buffed players, and we want them to be the only buffed players throughout the entire encounter. We can actually pull that off because we figured out as a community how this whole buff and trading the buff works. So let's say, for example, it starts off the same. Your 3 buff players, they hop into the buff ring down here at the bottom, they kill their 2 knights that are right here by the stairs when you spawn in, and they all assume their respective positions with their partner. And they just keep track of where their buffs are as their ads spawn all around, your knights and your acolytes and your thralls, your boomers up top, etc. And you're just mindful of what's going on. You're going to have some witches spawn here or there, cool, not a big deal. Some are buffed, some are unbuffed, cool. Let's say now our buff's starting to run out. What do? Well, the alternate way of having everyone go up to the witch's crystal and shoot it together while standing inside the ring and everyone swaps the buff, you don't have to be standing in the circle to activate the swap. So a cool thing that the community has figured out is that if the 3 buffed players get inside the ring and the 3 unbuffed players don't, then while the 3 buffed players are standing in the ring, any one of the unbuffed players, for sake of ease, it is always going to be mid because he's right in the middle and he's right by it, or her, you know, it's 2019. 3 buffed players are now standing in the circle, and they start shooting the witch's crystal while this person for mid, who is unbuffed, shoots the witch's crystal. Well, now, because there's no one in the witch's crystal to give the buff to, the 3 people in the witch's crystal lose their buff. All 3 of the people outside of the crystal never had the buff to get in the beginning, and so because they're not standing in the ring, they don't get it. And what can then happen is, if all of our buffed players go into the witch's crystal, stand in it together, shoot the witch's crystal, unbuffed player in the mid shoots it from the outside, they lose their buff, now no one has a buff, but the buff ring at the start of the encounter remains there. This is the only encounter that this happens in, so you have to be mindful that this is a one-trick pony. But if everyone who now used to have a buff but doesn't all runs back to the buff circle together, they can all step on it at the same time and re-receive their buff, which means that none of the unbuffed players have to take on the buff, and the 3 buffed players just have to lose it for about 5 to 8 seconds, run back over here and get it again, and then they just reassume their positions with their partners. And usually that can happen in just 1 round. So If the round starts, they take their buff, they kill their 2 knights, they go to their positions, cool, they run the encounter like normal. If the crystals haven't spawned by the time your buff starts to expire, doesn't matter. You just, the 3 of you, hop in the circle, have your person at mid shoot it, run back over here, re-receive your buff, then your crystals spawn, your ogres spawn, whatever happens, you're still the only 3 players that ever have to manage the buff, and the other players, preferably your warlocks who have wells or rifts and have high survivability over here under the statue's legs using cover and whatnot, they can really be your damage outputters on all your thrall and your acolytes and your stuff that your buffed players can't shoot anyway. So you can really customize your loadout, to being either a buffed player or an unbuffed player, because your unbuffed players need ad clearance supers and ad clearance weaponry, whereas your buffed players need high damage output on single targets like orange health bar knights. And when it comes time to kill your ogres, you just work together. So your buffed players, who are going to have high damage output on single targets, are going to slay their ogre in no time, and your lower damage output but your high ad clear ability supers and stuff, they're your unbuffed players. They're just going to pull out their outbreaks or their heavy weaponry that they're not utilizing, and they're just going to pop their ogre, and it's going to be square. You do this a total of 4 times, and you'll get sound cues when it happens. Start to finish, it looks the exact same as the other method, but instead of having everybody swapping buffs, only the 3 people are gaining and losing their buff over and over again. So you don't have the problem of having people not know what to shoot or where to be and what to shoot. It all runs the same, whether you do it the first method, second method. You spawn in, 3 people take the buff, kill their knights, ads spawn, you kill the ads, you kill until you can't kill anymore, and then you shoot your crystals, and you swap in your buffs, and you kill your ogres. Not taken, buffed or unbuffed, and that's the whole thing. After 4 rounds and you kill all the ads, it doesn't really expire, it just kind of ends. Some things pop up, you jump up and you get your chest, just like the video show. And that's encounter 1, mechanic wise. Sorry I don't have any video, I'm not fancy like that, but these are your drawings, study them up, know what to do.